go back to this amazing panel that we have. So there are a couple things that that have emerged from this conversation that I would like to draw out a little bit. We're going to have time in a little bit to get some more questions from all of you who have been participating in this afternoon. But in the meantime, I would like to personally draw out and stimulate some of this convo. A lot of what was emerging as well from most of the panelists was the theme around, feeling like, or not feeling like, but this experience of assimilation and this common experience of a lot of us as racialized individuals being forced to fit into this structure, this idea of Canada and what Canada is and what it should mean and what it should look like. And when I talk about assimilation, I'm talking about, the ways that we are forced to fit in, to shape into something else that erases our identities. And that applies between like racialized communities, indigenous communities. That project of assimilation is the backbone of what we know as Canada, right? And we see it specifically coming up in things like the Indian Act that was established in the 1870s, where the project was to Christianize and to assimilate and to make into one, to forget these deep ancestral roots that give us rights, that give us permission to be here. And this notion of assimilation also comes through in the theme that we have very commonly in Canada in particular around multiculturalism, that we can all, show a little bit of our culture, share each other's foods and dances, but when it actually comes to the deeper conversations around what does it mean to actually have stake, to actually have power, to actually have rights within a society that is built on stolen land, then that conversation changes, right? That conversation changes from, wanting to show off a lot of our dances or food or culture, making Canada this beautiful multicultural place to visit for tourists. But the tone turns a little bit differently when we actually start demanding power, asking for power to shape the own visions of our communities. Unfortunately, I think that this is also a very common theme. I know I experienced it myself growing up in schools in Alberta, growing up in mostly white environments, but this notion of, we are all the same, or we are all equals. And even though that is a really beautiful, utopia to imagine that all of us are equals and all of us, start from the same place, and if we just try hard enough, we can achieve what, the people in power have. And I think this is a really important notion to disrupt, especially, for teachers in classrooms, where I think a lot of us want to create those cultures of belonging, of like, wanting our students to feel like they're in a safer space, wanting our students to feel like, they're valued and that everyone is equal and everyone has an equal say. But the risk also comes at silencing or erasing our identities. And this is really important. To make sure that we're not doing that. And so this means doing things like fostering conversations within the classroom that ask students to talk about their different experiences, different perspectives, and to also have it be okay when they might be critical about the structures within the classroom, within the school, within the neighborhoods and communities that they're growing up on, supporting their initiatives when they are building relationships with each other to speak out around things like racial injustice like we're doing today, and continuing those relationships. Really, when students are telling us something that is on their hearts or that they see as a critique of what's happening in their school, it's really important that we listen and that we also don't take it personally, because that also is kind of like a sign of safety, that they're willing to share this with you because they see you as someone that they can confide in, that they can trust as well, to, perhaps shift the culture within the classroom or the school. Lastly, I just really want to touch upon, this idea of that all the speakers brought up, but this idea of like, racism only happening, in 2020, or that it just started happening when coronavirus hit. And a lot of the speakers were talking about, like specifically how people are kind of like shocked that this racism is existing in this country. But this has always existed, right? It has existed from the very moment that Canada was created, when we understand that Canada was built on stolen land. And that in and of itself is an act of racism, right? Specifically towards Indigenous peoples. And so we have to understand that racism has very deep roots. And we also have to understand that a lot of, the experiences of our communities that we, as younger people might feel really isolated in have deeper roots, right? They have deeper roots of a larger picture, of a larger system that affects all of our lives. And it's important, especially for youth, to be able to talk about their experiences, share their experiences that are different from one another, but also to understand that they are not necessarily at fault for, all of these tentacles that cause these things happening in their lives, right? These things are called classism. These things are called white supremacy. These things are called ableism. These things are called homophobia. All of these larger structures and systems that affect us as a group, but also at an individual level. So to kind of continue on this conversation, I would like to now turn things over to our panelists to talk a little bit more about some of the themes. And I'd like to kick off our conversation right now by asking you, so you are all, at one point young adults that have navigated, being in high school and transitioning into the wider world. What have you learned about identity and further your own racialization? And let's start maybe with Golsa, who was first.
Oh, that's a loaded question. Well, I'd like to still think of myself as a young adult, but overall, I think I didn't even realize that I was a racialized person until I came to Canada. I was a privileged Iranian when I was in Iran because I speak Farsi, because I wasn't a migrant. Maybe there is colorism against me, but overall, I was privileged. When I came to Canada, however, I think learning about race or racialization wasn't something that happened. It's not a specific instance that made me realize I'm a racialized person, but the whole process makes you understand the whole migration process, and the living experience in here makes you or forces you to understand that you are different, or you are not welcome, or you are welcome here. It's just, I don't know, being stopped at the trains all the time and being asked for ID, or being looked at in a weird way. It's just, I think it's very complicated for everyone how they come to realize they're racialized and how they come to terms with their racialization. But the important thing is to understand that race is not really a thing. It's just a concept of control. And if all of us, even if you're white, you are in a certain way controlled by race just because of the history and because of the meanings that you have been internalizing. So yeah, I guess it's very hard to just talk about the experience of racialization and understanding identity, but for every person it's just a different process, and different things make you come to terms with.
Thank you, Golsa. Brandon or Sammie Joe, did you want to share or add anything as well on that note?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a long process. I think also being queer, there was a intertwined coming to terms with sexuality, but also race that kind of have very similar experiences for me. I think when I was young, growing up in Langley, one of my things was to, a coping mechanism with being racialized in a very white environment was humor and self-deprecation. And it feeds into that idea around assimilation. So if you find that I'm funny, or I share in your racist jokes, I fit in. talking about like, even my dad did a lot of the same things where he was talking about like how bad Chinese people were at driving or whatever. Like it kind of reinforces a lot of those negative stereotypes, and you kind of sidle up to white supremacy in a way of like, look, I'm just like you. And that makes me part of the club, or part of like the in club, the in group, right? And being queer, growing up, realizing my sexuality as well, it was thinking about like, looking at Pride, like going to Pride for the first time and being like kind of freeing and liberating, but also kind of like scrutinizing in a way that was like, if you wanted to be treated like everyone else, why are you out here, talking about your sexuality and like wearing almost no clothing, and like, and this idea that for us to provide people with dignity and respect, that we all have to act and behave and look the same way. And that's not the case, right? We should afford people dignity and respect regardless of any of those things. And that's the kind of the politics of difference, right? It's like equity and liberation isn't about trying to create everyone being the same, but it's actually how we negotiate difference, and how we interact with each other. And one quote that I had in my presentation that was much longer is from Hannah Gadsby, who's a comedian out of Australia, and she talks about her if you've ever watched Nanette on Netflix, she talks about how she came to the realization that, I'll just read the quote. It says, "Do you understand what self-deprecation means when it comes from somebody who already exists in the margins? It's not humility, it's humiliation." And that idea that like reinforcing racism or white supremacy can come from within as well. So I think that for me is continuing to be a learning process. And also continues to be a learning process of like learning more about where my family's come from, and embracing that side of my family that I've actually long neglected or didn't want to learn about because of, white supremacy. But yeah.
Wow, thank you, Brandon. Yeah, that quote definitely resonates with me, that it's not humility, it's humiliation. Absolutely. Before we turn it over into the question and answer period, I'm going to just offer Sammie Jo the opportunity, if you want to weigh in on it, just like a minute, if you can.
Yeah, well, I'll add that there's so many things to say, but for me, I'm actually privileged to be born in Canada. I was born in Winnipeg, but I can speak and understand my language, and that is because being raised by my family and my grandfather, where I needed to communicate. But see, even growing up, we were still like the only Filipinos, but there was some Filipinos who were not proud of being Filipino. I was like super proud of being Filipino, but they were always seen as the janitor or the nanny or something like that. So even when you have the newcomers that come in, they're not necessarily proud that they came in from the Living Caregiver program, let's say. And growing up, there was those two classes. There was the newcomers, and then second generation, like the Canadian. So there in itself was already a divide where we look, some folks look down on the newcomers that didn't speak English well, or that, that were just, like anything, like dressed differently or whatnot, right? But for me, like in Canada, we didn't learn about our history, and I'm still trying to learn about my history and even our language. And so the more Canadian Filipinos that are living here, we're losing our identity and our culture and our history because we weren't taught that. And so that's one of the things that I value, is just wanting to learn and listen to our elders. And so before they go, so because Canada is so multicultural, and we just need to keep those cultures alive and instilled in everything that we do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sammie Jo, and for all of you for engaging in that conversation. Definitely can relate to that feeling of, survival strategies, to be able to deal with the amount of racism and assimilation strategies in our society. We're going to open it up, and I first wanted to go back to a question that was actually made previously by a participant in the last 20 seconds that Brandon was speaking. So Brandon, I'm going to just direct this question to you. So the question was, can you speak a bit to the escalation of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, and at the same time, the reality of anti-Muslim and anti-Blackness systemically from the Chinese government, and some of the silences we see on that in the diaspora? And also just being mindful of time. We have about 2 more minutes before we have to wrap everything up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot, right? I think anti-Blackness is rampant in a lot of communities of color, anti-indigeneity as well. And I think that for a lot of young people growing up, either first generation or second generation, there's a difference in comprehension of understanding where these things come from. Because I think that for a lot of newcomers, sometimes access to resources can be scarce, and language could be a barrier. And also, like, when you're a young person in a newcomer household, you might be learning about these things potentially in school, but there's not a lot of capacity for you to maybe share with your family, and maybe they don't speak English and you're like the primary caregiver as a young person. There's a lot of complexity in trying to have complex racial discussions. I think that one thing I've noticed in Vancouver is trying to have these discussions around holding states accountable that also have this kind of like relation to race or a group of people. And you see that again with the state of Israel and the Jewish community. And we have that with the Chinese government and the Chinese community and like the Chinese community, because like, there's Hong Kong and Taiwan, both I see as very much independent of the Chinese government. But, there's another discussion there. And then I see that sometimes the way in which those conversations are co-opted by people who want to just be racist, who see like our problems in Vancouver around housing as a problem with newcomer Chinese, versus a problem of maybe, let's say, capitalism or theft of unceded territories. Like there's a lot of that.
Sorry, Brandon.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, that's basically a PhD dissertation in that question, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a very meaty question. Holy smokes. And I love just the caliber of questions that are coming in, and I'm so excited to see all the questions percolating. Just a reminder again that we can continue these discussions again with each other as well, beyond the time of this meeting. To keep those questions, write them down. They're really great conversation starters, even amongst your peers. So we're going to go over just 5 minutes. I've received the go-ahead from the organizing crew, just to ask one final question that came from a participant. So how could have teachers during your high school experience made a difference in addressing racism in society? So whoever feels called to get us started first on that question can go for it. Again, just watching time, we're going to have just a couple minutes to answer this collectively.
Hi. I feel like in high schools or generally in the school system, talking about racism or bringing it up is something to shy away from, and people are, I don't know, ashamed of it or unwilling to admit that it exists. I don't think I've really had any profound discussions around race and racism in school, and there have been very, very few teachers who've been willing to address it. I think the most important thing is just being willing to open the discussion around that. If there is a comment, or even if you make a mistake, if you say something, if you perpetuate any stereotypes as a teacher, to own it and start a conversation and admit that you have made a mistake and that it wasn't right to say something, that it wasn't right to call out a student for speaking in their mother tongue, to just be willing to understand that small incidents that happen in the classroom can really affect someone in very, very strong and negative ways. That you may just witness it and think that it's a joke or something that goes on and everyone forgets about, but it can be stuck in someone's head forever. Like, there have been times that I've had experiences in classroom with teachers or with other students that after years I'm still thinking about, and it still breaks my heart to have heard something like that or have experienced that. So I think it's just teachers being the key to opening these conversations and really making people feel comfortable. And especially if you have newcomer students, if you have students who are already very isolated, to give the opportunity to them to sort of introduce themselves and who they are to the classroom. Because I was a newcomer in 2 schools in BC, and I never talked to anyone in any classes because I was never given the opportunity to really connect with anyone. It's like this new girl and she looks different and she has an accent and no one wants to talk to her. So yeah, I feel like just really allowing them to express themselves and open up and say something in their language or things like that can really make a profound impact.
Beautiful. Thank you, Golsa. We have about a minute left, so maybe Brandon and Sammie Jones, 30 seconds if you can. I'm going to start with Sammie Jones and end off with Brandon.
I agree and echo with Golsa. The school and your teacher's relationship is basically safe space, and it's practice. I mean, you have to think about it. As a teacher, you're seeing these kids more than their own parents, because these parents are working 2 to 3 jobs and they're not home. And so for me, I can just reflect on my work as a youth worker in these high schools, is that I don't, when I hear the feedback, it's not really in the classes, but it's like the after school programs, like the youth groups, that they really get to talk about these conversations. And really they're all about, sharing stories. That's what I loved about it. You hear their stories, and they have a safe place to speak. So really it is just, as a teacher, just listening and giving them that space and giving them the ability to practice, how to use, certain languages and certain terms, and being safe in Canada, really.
Thank you, Sammie. Lastly, Brandon, last 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just talk a bit about curriculum, because that's kind of what I do in my day job. And that curriculum should be both a mirror and a window. And so the curriculum should reflect the reality of the students in your classroom, but it should also allow to have that insight into other cultures, different ways of being, different ways of existing, and thinking about the way in which you share resources, or even just posters put up around the classroom, the way that actually affects the environment to have conversations as well. So that's one important thing, is just being open to that. And of course, there's lots of other things to talk about, but I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Yeah, absolutely. Teachers definitely being critical and being the start of creating safer environments that foster and that nourish the deep wisdom and all the deep identities that all of us carry with us, as well as students within the classroom. So I would like to thank all of our panelists that joined us today, to Brandon, to Golsa, to Sammie Jo,